I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Dale Manugduck, CBC Toronto. Acknowledging that IRCC has, helped move hundreds of refugees from Toronto churches to Cornwall, Niagara Falls, Windsor. There's obviously still record numbers of refugee claimants coming to Canada, Toronto specifically. What is the sustainable approach moving forward?
Really good question, Dale. I think we can acknowledge that we all, any level of government, haven't done a good enough job. The winter's coming, and there's some folks that don't have roofs over their heads, and the ones they do have are pretty precarious. I guess I'll talk specifically about the City of Toronto because I'm here, and I think your listeners would appreciate hearing what the federal government's doing. First, as you've heard and probably covered over the last couple of days, we are going to join the table that Mayor Chow is with the province of Ontario. That's really important. I've said all along that we need to have a coordinated approach in how we welcome asylum seekers. This isn't a problem that's going away, and I think that is a reality that Canada needs to face. We got two big bodies of ocean to the west and the east of us, some ice to the north, and a nuclear superpower to the south. So we aren't in the position of countries like Italy and parts of Europe where you're seeing a swath of asylum seekers fleeing war, famine, you name it. But asylum seekers are finding their way into this country. And frankly, I'm not going to fault them for it. The way Canada needs to welcome people needs to be done in a way that Canadians expect us to welcome people, which is in a concerted, cooperative way. That hasn't necessarily been done. We've seen in my own provinces the challenges around Roxham Road and irregular migration. So getting our acts together means a number of things. It means looking at the federal government for investments. We've put a lot of money into the City of Toronto. We're willing to make significant investments in addition, but it doesn't come without some assurances that the City of Toronto is also doing what it needs to do, and that the province of Ontario is stepping up. We're working on a number of options in the short to medium term to work with Mayor Chow in making sure people have roofs over their heads, especially with the weather getting colder. I don't want a Bigfooter, so I'll keep those discussions and the details of those discussions a little less public than I normally would. Obviously, she's the mayor of the city and represents Torontonians, so I don't want to come in here and announce things and cut the wind under her feet on that level. But we are working on a number of options, making sure that we have taken steps as a federal government within our own role, redistributing people where they agree and consent to go. I don't want to treat people like cattle. We have to make sure that there's consent to move people. I think it's a basic human right. Also making sure that when we are going in to particular places that we are accelerating the triage time, closing that triage time will actually allow people to be determined and get due process to see if they are refugees or entitled to stay or not in this country. And when we're not coordinated as governments, it actually extends that time. Issuing work permits, we know that our government and our department, my department in particular, is working with a number of companies to make sure that they are matching skill sets and the need to work with the labor shortages that some of those companies are facing. But that's also something that we've done by doing blitzes in the churches in particular, so that people can actually get some money in their pocket to as a matter of dignity, but also as a matter of sustainability for the families. So all this to say that we've seen what's happening. No guarantees that this is actually going to get better in a world where we have mass irregular migration. We've reached that dubious, ominous 100 million mark across the world in terms of displaced persons. That's scary, and it should scare a lot of folks. But I think we can do it as a country and be a little more coordinated in our approach. That goes for the City of Toronto, but also the GTA. We're feeling the pressure from cities, and outside the GTA, in where I work in Ottawa, it's also a challenge. So all that to say is we need to get a lot better at coordinating things a lot faster.
Just ask you one specific follow-up to that. Today, over 150 faith leaders wrote you a letter. Two of the solutions that they're asking from the federal government is to open up federal armories for emergency shelter, as well as establish a reception center at Toronto Pearson for refugee claimants. What is the federal government's position on those two possible solutions?
Yeah, again, working with the City of Toronto and the province of Ontario, I think we'll hopefully have some solutions in the short term. I don't know if armories are ideal, frankly. not completely removing them off the table. We have to look at what is the proper place to house people. I think the government of Canada is willing to step up financially in supporting Toronto in some of its initiatives. I'm not entirely sure that armories are ideal. Churches aren't ideal. There's perhaps 1 or 2 toilets in a church. Armories have mass showers. They are being used by the military. So not the proper and dignified way to welcome people. I think we can do a little better than that. Not against the concept, but again, acknowledge the call by faith leaders who shouldn't have had this on their shoulders in the first place. But I know their hearts are in it, so they should know that we are working with the government of Ontario and Mayor Chow in particular to provide some short-term solutions that are a little more dignified than just having people in armories.
CBC News, I would love to get the questions answered both in English and French. Thank you.
Sure.
Is the Canadian government planning to buy Pakistani visas for the Afghan refugees who's been waiting for 2 years to come to this country get approved in order to avoid having them deported back to Afghanistan?
J'ai été en contact avec le ministre de l'Intérieur du Pakistan ce dimanche dernier. Conversation très brève, mais pour manifester le point de vue du Canada, évidemment de façon diplomatique, pour s'assurer que les personnes qu'on va amener au Canada sont en fait protégées, qui ne sont pas refoulées ou déportées au Pakistan, en Afghanistan. Je reconnais en même temps que le Pakistan fait face à beaucoup de forces sociales avec beaucoup d'effets que ça a eu sur le Pakistan, notamment au-delà d'1 million de réfugiés afghans. Je trouve ça très troublant que le gouvernement du Pakistan soit résigné à déporter peut-être 1 million de personnes en Afghanistan où ils seraient exposés à des menaces, même des menaces de mort. Alors, c'est quelque chose que j'ai manifesté à l'écrit, mais aussi à l'oral au ministre de l'Intérieur, évidemment, en tout respect. Mais pour aussi lui assurer que nous allions continuer dans nos efforts d'amener des Afghans au-delà du 40 000 qu'on s'est fixé comme gouvernement il y a 2 ans, objectif qu'on a atteint tout récemment dans la dernière semaine, et j'espère bien voir des vols arriver au Canada dans un avenir très proche. Sachez que la difficulté se situe comme vous l'avez énoncé, c'est-à-dire d'obtenir des visas de sortie pour nos ressortissants, pour les gens qui sont protégés, mais en même temps, on ne veut pas qu'ils soient déportés. Alors, c'est très difficile. Nous avons une capacité d'accueil qui est quand même limitée, mais il reste qu'il y a beaucoup de travail à faire, puis qu'il y a des gens qui sont nos clients en Afghanistan, au Pakistan plutôt qu'on essaie de sortir au plus vite. In English, I had the chance to speak briefly to the Minister of the Interior on Sunday, followed up by a letter expressing my concern with the treatment of protected persons, Afghans in Pakistan. Obviously with the concern that I have not to interfere with their domestic affairs. They do have well over 1 million Afghan refugees that are in Pakistan, which has had an impact on them politically. I absolutely acknowledge that. My interest was, my point in that conversation was to convey our interest in protecting our clients in Pakistan, Afghans that we have undertaken to bring back here to make sure that they are deported and may face death in Afghanistan. And so we are, I know there are a number of international humanitarian matters going on in the world, but this is one that is one of intense focus of my particular department and of foreign affairs. So we're keeping the lines of communication open. There are challenges getting specific exit visas for Afghans seeking to be relocated into Canada. And I'd simply finish in saying that we did reach our 40,000 person Afghan relocation number that we had set as a government, but it is not a ceiling as such, and we'll continue to evacuate people, circumstances permitting, in the following weeks, and obviously as quickly as we can as a government.
Minister, you did say in French that there were flights that you were
hoping to see flights. Can't speak too publicly about them until they've actually landed, but it's an ongoing discussion with the government of Pakistan, and we obviously my conversation was to seek assurances, to give them our assurances that we will continue to evacuate people within our means.
I just want to clarify, because in French, I thought you just said that there are...
My head doesn't translate literally, it just,
Understood.
yeah, no, but there are, we are planning flights in the coming weeks, but I can't speak to specific times and locations. No, please.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been in the office for about 8 years. Do you think it's time for him to step aside? What can the Liberal government do to kind of turn around the public perception and the polls right now?
So the answer is no. Obviously, people look at polls. I think we also are in the business of governing, and if you govern by polls, it creates some pretty bad results. I think we've seen previous governments governed by public sentiment or media cycles or polls with disastrous results. I think we got to look at a longer term course than that. There are plenty of governments that have gone into elections trailing desperately and have come back into power, and there's plenty of governments that have gone in the lead that haven't maintained their lead and lost. So don't worry too much about it, but obviously we have to keep connected to people, and the best way to do that is to govern properly. You know, we talk a lot about ambitious policy, but as a minister, as a prime minister, our primary job is to do our own jobs well and to do it consistently. En français. Bon, ben je pense que je veux pas que le premier ministre démissionne, clairement. Si je regarde des sondages, oui, je regarde des sondages. C'est clair qu'il ne faut pas gouverner par sondage ou par cycle médiatique. On en est conscient, évidemment, mais la réalité, c'est que pour gouverner, ça prend une vision plus longue qu'un cycle de 24 heures. C'est clair qu'on est conscient des défis auxquels les gens font face, notamment l'abordabilité, réduction des taux d'intérêt, etc., difficulté à rejoindre les deux bouts à la fin du mois. C'est clairement la raison pour laquelle on a pris cette décision, évidemment, d'enlever la taxe sur le mazout, l'huile de chauffage. Mais en même temps, là, ça prend une vision de plus longue que 24 heures, c'est-à-dire il faut qu'on s'assure de pouvoir bien gouverner. Le travail d'un ministre est très complexe, mais à sa base, c'est de travailler puis bien faire sa job à chaque heure, 24 heures, 7 jours sur 7.
Hier, vous avez annoncé les cibles de communication francophone hors Québec. Vous avez augmenté à 6% pour 2024. Vous avez dit que c'est choisi parce que c'est réaliste. Par contre, les organismes francophones sont déçus. Ils disent que c'est très loin de ce à quoi ils auraient espéré. Ils s'attendaient au double. Qu'est-ce que vous avez à dire à ces organismes?
Ben, je leur avais dit très clairement en personne, en privé, qu'il fallait être réaliste. J'aime mieux qu'ils soient déçus aujourd'hui que déçus dans un an. Je ne veux pas jouer le coup du politicien qui fait des fausses promesses, puis dans un an, c'est la déception totale. Je connais les effectifs, les limites de mon département, quoique je sois là depuis 3 mois. On a atteint comme gouvernement de peine et misère un 4,4% d'immigration francophone hors Québec, sans vraiment mettre en place les mécanismes. On puisait plutôt dans l'inventaire, sans trouver des pistes de solutions pour des réformes de la politique publique pour s'assurer, par exemple, que des enseignants puissent venir en ruralité, dans les communautés francophones, pour s'assurer peut-être que les étudiants qui parlent français puissent s'établir dans ces communautés, et même de favoriser les pays où on n'a pas trop bien fait notre travail, c'est-à-dire en Afrique de l'Ouest, au Vietnam, en Europe, où les gens parlent évidemment un français impeccable. C'est pas quelque chose qu'on a mis en place de façon systématique. Alors, d'un, j'ai trop de respect pour la FCFA, entre autres, pour leur mentir puis leur induire en erreur. J'ai donné un coup de barre à mon ministère, notamment pour les assurer, que je m'assure qu'ils se dépassent. Le 4,4 quand même, c'était une augmentation de 450 %. Là, on demande un 50 % à 6 %, quitte à l'augmenter à 7-8 %. Je pourrais regarder selon la performance de mon département dans un an, ces cibles, je suis prêt à les réviser. Je ne suis pas une personne particulièrement dogmatique, mais je suis aussi réaliste, puis je voulais pas les induire en erreur. Je pense, tu sais, les gens qui militent, c'est des gens qui militent, je leur en veux rien. Ils ont été très déçus par le passé, mais maintenant, c'est l'occasion qu'ils viennent au sein de notre ministère pour nous aider à rencontrer quand même des cibles qui sont très ambitieuses.
Justement, vous avez dit qu'il y avait des possibilités d'augmenter le taux à 7-8% en
Oui.
2025. Vous allez réévaluer peut-être la situation. Qu'est-ce que ça prend pour que vous disiez, OK, oui, on l'augmente?
Je suis là depuis 3 mois. Je n'ai pas l'assurance au sein de mon ministère de pouvoir rencontrer les cibles. Durant les 6-7 mois à venir, je vais regarder la mécanique en place. Je pense que j'ai dit hier, par exemple, que je suis plus à l'aise de rater la cible de 6% si j'ai la mécanique en place pour pouvoir monter de 6 à 7 à 8% que de rencontrer le 6%, puiser dans l'inventaire, puis de faire ça un peu à l'emporte-pièce, sans l'assurance qu'on va pouvoir augmenter ça à 7, 8, 9%. C'est un projet de société. La question aussi qu'on se pose, est-ce que cette pérennité du fait français hors du Québec s'assure uniquement à cause de dû à l'immigration? Je pense que la réponse, c'est non. Il y a un défi d'intégration. Je ne peux pas demander à un couple du Vietnam, un couple du Sénégal, un couple de la France de soudainement, du jour au lendemain, d'être le porte-étendard du fait français hors du Québec. Ils ont leur choix, c'est des êtres humains. Mais je pense que les communautés elles-mêmes vont pouvoir les aider. Une augmentation trop forte, trop vite peut avoir des effets pervers. Si je mets une tonne de gens qui parlent français au centre-ville de Toronto, il y a des enjeux d'intégration pour qu'ils apprennent l'anglais, par exemple. Puis dans 2 générations, ce sont des gens qui vont perdre leur langue. Alors, ce n'est pas une question simplement de chiffres, mais de la réalité humaine du fait français hors du Québec qui est et qui sera toujours menacée. Mais ça va prendre plus d'appui du gouvernement du fédéral, du gouvernement de l'Ontario, du Nouveau-Brunswick et de l'Alberta, entre autres, et du Manitoba, entre autres, mais de toutes les provinces pour s'assurer que c'est un projet de société réussi.
Marine, pour une radio francophone
Merci.
également. Justement, vous parlez de société. Dans 1 an, les établissements de services francophones vont répondre à l'appel à proposition de l'IRCC. La communauté francophone, surtout à Toronto, a besoin de relationnel plus que de services directs. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose que l'IRCC va prendre en compte dans les propositions offertes par les établissements, plus qu'un objectif de chiffres et de services, mais de relationnel et de création de communauté?
Je suis prêt à être flexible en regardant les propositions. Je ne suis pas à jour dans les demandes spécifiquement de la Ville de Toronto et des institutions qui appuient les communautés francophones. Il va falloir regarder ça de plus près et je suis prêt à le faire. C'est clair que c'est un domaine où on a très peu investi par le passé, puis qu'il va falloir être flexible dépendant de la réalité à laquelle fait face une organisation particulière, que ce soit une organisation à Toronto, à London, à Moncton. Je pense que les besoins sont un peu différents. Merci.
Nagra with the Canadian Press. 2 questions for you. Yesterday, you intervened in the case of an Egyptian refugee claimant who was said to be deported yesterday. This isn't the first case of Egyptians involved with the Freedom and Justice Party being ordered to be deported back, where they say they face a risk of violent persecution. Just wondering what your view is on the risk that those people face, and should they be offered refuge in Canada?
Look, I can't speak publicly about any particular case. Clearly, when someone faces the real threat of the death penalty being posed, which we are opposed to as a government, our government does need to act. Obviously, people fleeing persecution for various reasons need to be looked at on an individual basis. But again, very difficult for me to speak about the discretion that I use in particular situations, because it can affect the public policy on an ongoing basis, but also the basis on which we welcome and take difficult decisions to remove people. There are compelling cases that do come in front of me, but those are cases that I have to be quite judicious in speaking publicly on, foremost because of the privacy concerns of the clients that we serve that are facing some very difficult and desperate situations. I would say even more so in the eventuality that that there is temporary respite and that they are perhaps eventually returned to the country from which they hailed and may face increased public scrutiny and perhaps even persecution. So as much as I like to answer questions directly, it's something that I have to remain a little more careful in speaking publicly on.
Absolutely, and you spoke about recalibrating the number of temporary residents in Canada. Can you give us a more specific indication of what those recalibrations could look like?
I can speak to themes. I think I've spoken quite publicly, extensively in the international student space. First and foremost, doing the job that people have elected me to do in this case is making sure that the system retains its integrity, getting rid of some of the most egregious forms of fraud that people whose hope is falsely entertained come to this country and see it dashed by unscrupulous agents or people trying to make a quick buck, and address some of the systemic problems that international students have faced, whether it's housing, access to services, or the general student experience. So that's something that will be ongoing and progressive as we look and re-examine the challenges that the pure volume of international students coming to this country has faced, including the real difficult challenge of post-secondary underfinancing, which has been systemic in parts of Canada, mostly fueled by the fact that they haven't been supported by their provinces, and institutions have adapted to a very lucrative model. What I don't want is to stigmatize those people. In other spaces like agriculture, I think we have to attack more cohesively and comprehensively the real reality of the human experience that people come here. Their temporary foreign worker status is often exploited. There are good stories and there are bad stories. I don't want to paint everyone with that brush, but there are incentives that are created by the temporary foreign worker programs. People that can't choose and switch jobs if they are abused or have unsafe work conditions. The fact that they are threatened with return to their country if they don't perform well. Those are all real threats. I do acknowledge at the same time that there are some people that come here for a temporary basis to feed and nourish their family abroad. There's an economic incentive to that. They have no particular need or want to stay in this country. But again, there is a whole ecosystem there that we need to address comprehensively. A lot of that falls within jurisdictions of provinces, but also of my colleague Randy Boissonneau's work we'll be doing together to hopefully clean up. Again, there'll be no sort of draconian measures that will be taken immediately, but as we examine particularly reports and studies that are coming out of the Senate and what we are hearing from the UN Special Rapporteur, it is an area where we have become quite addicted as a country to temporary foreign workers, and it's having perverse carry-on effects that perhaps were predictable, but I think unanticipated by some folks in the short term. Again, broad brushstrokes, because I think particular measures will have to be addressed in a very surgical way in the very near future, in my opinion.
Hi, Minister. Naeem from the Financial Post. Just wondering, did the sharp rise in the number of temporary residents influence the decision, yesterday's decision, to not increase the permanent resident target?
I wouldn't say directly, and I think it's important to recognize that a good chunk of that permanent residency itself are people that are here on a temporary basis, and there is a pathway to permanent residency. It is not the case that every person that's here temporarily has a pathway to permanent residency, and by extension, almost always Canadian citizenship. I think what it did focus the mind on is to make sure that we are doing our job in the particular areas that we control as a government to a large extent, whether it's the economic portion of permanent residency, which is 60% of that envelope, a big driver of the gross domestic product, a good driver of the net entrance into the workforce, parents and spouses, which is, has an economic portion to it, but it is another 20% of the equation, and then protected persons. The exercise that I went through in the last day or even weeks is one that is really statutorily driven by the acts that I administer as the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. It isn't a full snapshot of the portrait of people that come to this country. And I think, speaking to people at the Howe Institute today, clearly there is a need for better numbers and making sure that we are giving a proper snapshot to Canadians, to analysts, to provinces, to territories of what exactly that number looks for so that we can better plan and prepare. Now, I'll also add that having those statistics clearly set out doesn't mean that every province and territory and even federal government of the day will properly plan for it. There are political opportunities that kind of go against that at times, and I think that is just the reality of being humans and governing. But we do have to get better at making sure that we have a subset of statistics that people can say, well, hey, look, this volume is affecting, for example, this particular area of the housing market. This is having an impact on this particular area of the healthcare system, and that we are refining our tools, and that's the exercise that I need to go through in the next year to make sure we are refining our tools to actually fine-tune the ways in which and the mechanisms we use to bring people into the country to fill labor shortages, whether it's in nursing, whether it's particular areas of the construction industry. We've largely acted in broad economic brushstrokes as a country, despite the fact that we're pretty much the top in class compared with similarly situated countries. All I have to do is go abroad and talk to my partners in different immigration portfolios, and they rave at what Canada is doing. But it's not perfect, and I think adjusting that and fine-tuning that to real microeconomic realities of different markets, down to even industry codes for different types of jobs, is something we need to start trending towards, because then we're really starting to match supply and demand, as opposed to kind of this sense of hope that Canada is a great country. And then people come here and end up doing something else and sacrifice their own generation for their next one, which is a lot of the motivation for people that come to this country. But it's a market failure that we're not closing that gap earlier. Will it be perfect over the course of the next year? Absolutely not. But I think some of the instruments and public policy measures that we plan to make are ones that will better align industry needs with the federal government's role. And I'm leaving out discussion, a very important jurisdictional discussion with the provinces for purposes of brevity, but it is part of the equation we're looking at.
What are the infrastructure in place that doesn't advising that make you confident that you'd be able to meet the immigration targets?
And when you talk about infrastructure, do you mean the mechanisms we have in place, or do you mean some of the pressures we're feeling from? I think we do have a clear sense of what the demand is, and that was the intellectual exercise that we undertook over the last months, and trying to, up to the very last day, and trying to fix what those levels would be. The strategic immigration review that my predecessor, Sean Fraser, spearheaded and my department supported, talked to thousands of people across the country, that basically came back with three conclusions. One, the federal government needs to do a better job in its own area, closing up the delay times in visa processing, which we've done in part, actually with some success, not perfect yet. That we are actually coordinating better with provinces to reflect the needs in their own jurisdictions in housing, healthcare, education services, and also modernizing a system that really hasn't been adapted to the 21st century. So moving to a more digital platform and doing that in a way that is done without causing even more headaches, which I don't exclude for the moment. And finally, I think specializing and fine-tuning some of the public policy tools that have been kind of blunt instruments to deal with broad macroeconomic premises and challenges that we face as a country: aging population, people aging out of particular industries quicker than others, and really fine-tuning that to a more surgical approach and making sure that we are matching that supply and demand, which has only been done in a rather rough fashion outside the temporary foreign worker space, which has its challenges associated to it that I spoke to a couple seconds ago to your colleagues. And then, frankly, working better with provinces and territories. But you have a particular example of that today in some of the questions your colleagues posed with respect to asylum seekers in the city of Toronto, dealing with the human reality of people that need a roof over their head as quickly as possible before winter, and then looking at a longer-term solution to address migration flows and see what we can tweak federally to make sure that we are managing a system that we have some control over, but not an airtight control. That's it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.